Hey guys, how's it going? I'm doing this debate on somebody else's channel, so we're waiting for them. Yes, this is live, best in show. This is definitely live. I agree. I agree. God, that is one of the worst arguments for you, for sure. The free sub BS. Uh, Phil, who are you in Discord? Are you in my Discord? PNR is politics and religion, the Discord server. Phil, what's your name in Discord? Are you a mod on my Discord, Phil? If not, join my Patreon. Become a mod. Post combos. You can like debunk precept.
Welcome to another edition of P or A. I'm your host, David Russell. I'm joined here with my co-host, Caleb Jackson. What's up, Caleb?
What's up, David?
How you doing, man? What's been going on?
It's been pretty usual, just prepping for a lot of debates, a lot of writing, just going back and forth between life and this. So it's nice to be here.
Nice, man. Well, everybody, today we got a really good debate coming for you, or discussion. It's going to be kind of informal. We've got TJump, his first time on the show. So let's welcome him real quick. What's up, Tom?
Not much. How are you guys doing?
Good, man. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your channel and what you do, man?
I'm an atheist. I do debates on whether or not God exists and usually invite on professors and philosophers. Check out my Discord, discord.io/TJump. You can sign up on Patreon, be a mod, host conversations with annoy people. That'd be great.
Right on, right on. So what got you into all that, man?
Well, I was started inviting out professors to coffee and recording conversations with them because I couldn't remember everything in the conversations. And then I would upload them to my YouTube channel, and I'd happen to start getting a decent following from doing that, and turned it into a career.
Wow. Yeah, it's kind of funny, man, because I didn't think you could forget things, man, because you're pretty sharp when it comes to debating and stuff like that. So, but if you guys don't know Tom, man, you haven't been around this community a lot. So, our next guest here is Dale Glover. He's no stranger to the show. So, let's welcome Dale.
Hey, David. Thanks for having me.
Of course. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your ministry and what you got going on?
Yeah, so I'm the host of the Real Seekers podcast. I basically, same as Tom, sometimes I'll have professors on and that sort of thing to discuss various aspects related to the philosophy of religion and the truth of Christianity. I also am the co-host of the Theo Geeks podcast with Mr. Russell himself here. So I do that once a month, and yeah, that's me.
Right on. Well, guys, we have an exciting show for you. It's going to be on the ontological argument. It's kind of funny because I was like, let's do the series, and Dale was like, "Hey, the ontological argument's good," and in Tom's email, he's like, "Hey, I like discussing the ontological argument." And then I heard them both discussing it one time on Tom's show, and I was like, "Well, let's get them over here and have another discussion on it and see how that goes." So that's why I got you guys here, and we have Dale, who's going to be affirming the ontological argument for the existence of God, and both guys will have an opening statement, about 10 to 12 minutes roughly. You don't have to take that time; you can, and then we'll just go into conversation from there. So, without further ado, I'm going to let Dale kick it off here with his opening statement.
All right. So basically, the ontological argument, in a nutshell, it's argument that takes the truth of general metaphysical principles plus the definition of what the essence or nature of God is, and tries to say, well, therefore God exists. And just historically, there have been about three stages in development in the argument. So, first stage was back in the 11th century. A guy named Anselm invented the argument. The second stage was really came in around the 17th and 18th century with people like Descartes and Leibniz, who had their own versions. And the key insight at that time was, look, if it's possible that God exists, then he therefore exists. And then the third stage, which is what we're in right now, this came around in the 20th century with the use of modern modal logic, and people started coming up with modal versions of the ontological argument. And that's what I'm going to be doing. I'm going to be presenting one of those here today. Okay, so let me see if I can do this and not waste too much time. Okay, so share screen. Oh, okay, so I guess I can't do that. So, all right, never mind. So I'll tell you what the premises are then. Okay, so premise number one of the argument is that it is possible that a real maximally great being exists. And TJump, make note of that real maximally great. So it's slightly different than planting is. Premise two, if it is possible that a real maximally great being exists, then a real maximally great being exists in some possible world. And if premise three, if a real maximally great being exists in some possible world, then it exists in every possible world. If a real maximally great being exists in every possible world, then it exists in the actual world. And obviously, premise five, if it exists in the actual world, then it exists. So that's the conclusion, that a real maximally great being exists. So just some quick definitional clarification here. So in terms of possible worlds, what do we mean by that? I know TJump is well familiar with it, but for the sake of the audience, it's basically in modal logic, it's a helpful visual aid or a heuristic to understanding the modes that a thing can exist in. So things can be logically necessary. And possible world semantics, that just means that it exists in every single possible world. There are contingent things. So those are things that exist in some possible worlds, but don't exist in others. And then there are logically impossible things like square circles, married bachelors. They don't exist in any possible worlds. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about possible worlds here. Secondly, and most importantly, what the heck is a real maximally great being? So basically, I'm taking this as a modification from Dr. Yujin Nagasawa's 2017 work. And he defines it simply as, quote unquote, a being that has the properties of both real maximal excellence plus metaphysical necessity. Okay, so great. So what is a real maximally excellent being then? And that's just defined as minimally. It's a being that minimally has the maximal consistent, or what philosophers call compossible set of knowledge, power, and benevolence. So that's the definition of what that is. So, okay, great. So with that set in place, what can a skeptic say? There are basically four main common substantive objections to an ontological argument that people can give. So the first is just to deny outright that it's logically valid. People can say, well, look, the conclusion doesn't follow necessary and inevitably from the presumed truth of the premises. It's not truth preserving, as philosophers say. Secondly, it might be valid proper, but perhaps we're committing a logical fallacy, and in that case, it would be invalid. So the main one that I prepared for was begging the question. I know that TJump thinks we're committing other fallacies as well, like the reification fallacy, for example. So, cool. And also, you can object to it. Okay, maybe it's valid. It doesn't commit any fallacies, but it's unsound. One or more of the premises are untrue, or at the very least, we're not epistemically warranted in believing that they're probably true on a balance of probabilities. And one of the main ways of doing this is arguments through parodies. So you'll see a bunch of stuff, parody arguments. So yeah, just going into that a bit. Let me see how much time I've got. Okay, perfect. So in terms of the logical validity, pretty much nobody denies whether you're atheist, skeptic, or not. In fact, TJump himself admits that the argument is logically valid. The conclusion does follow necessarily and inevitably from the presumed truth of the premises in the argument. Now, in terms of begging the question, I'll just address that because that was the fallacy I thought was most common. So begging the question is a fallacy where basically if your main reason or a necessary part of your reason for accepting the truth of one or more of the premises comes from the fact that you just accept the truth of the conclusion, well, that's called begging the question, and that's fallacious reasoning. So it's kind of equivalent to saying, look, either this real maximally great being exists or the moon is made of green cheese. Premise two, the moon is not made of green cheese, therefore this real maximally great being exists. Well, that's begging the question. The only reason I accept the first premise is because I believe the conclusion already. And in terms of the modal ontological argument, we're obviously not doing that here. We have independent reasons for believing the truth of each of these premises, and in that way, we're not just assuming the truth of the conclusion. All we're doing is basically showing that the first premise is logically equivalent to the truth of the conclusion. If it's possible that this necessary being exists, well, then that's the same as it's necessary that this being exists. This is an axiom known as axiom S5, or there's axiom B if you want to get this as well. Okay, so with that said, what about the soundness? That's really what the debate's about. And in terms of the soundness of the argument, are these premises actually true or not? It may surprise some on here that basically all of the premises 2 through 5, are almost universally accepted. There might be a couple of objections to axiom S5, for example, for premise 4, I think it is, or maybe you reject trans world identity and therefore you might reject premise 3. But for the most part, whether you're atheist, agnostic thing, everyone kind of accepts the truth of these premises. And the scholarly debate is over the first premise. Is it metaphysically possible that this real maximally great being exists or not? And just to understand, when we're talking about possibility here, we're not just talking about epistemic possibility. For all I know, maybe it's possible, maybe it's not. What do I know? That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about metaphysical possibility here. So it's an ontological notion that regardless of whether I know it or not, there is this, it is possible that this being exists. So just understand that. And okay, so how do we argue for the truth of this possibility premise? And there are 3 main ways. So the first way is based on a priori reasoning. This is how I argued with TJump in our last discussion together on his show. And I appeal to our modal evaluating faculties. They produce a properly basic belief or a modal intuition that yes, it is conceivable that such a being as I've defined it exists. And by conceivability, I'm talking about a strict kind, not just prima facie conceivability, but what I call warranted conceivability there. So, okay, so the second way is through a posteriori, can't say it, through separate objective arguments. So there's been several arguments, and I'll post these on my blog, like articles for people to read, but you'll have someone like Ben Arbour, who TJump's debated and a couple times, I think, or Dr. William Lane Craig. They'll appeal to separate arguments to prove each of the properties bottom up. So for example, there's a conceptual argument that proves there must be a necessary omniscient being. Okay, great, that's one of the properties. of maximal excellence, or Jerome Gelman. He has an argument proving that there's one necessary omnipotent being. Okay, great. You can put those together and kind of build up a case from the bottom up. People like Alexander Proust have arguments like from the motivational center of our lives, or an experiential thing based on religious experiences that endure of this real maximally great being. He thinks you can prove that it's at least possible. Robert Madoyle has the modal perfection argument. So I know TJump did a sort of video kind of, I'll let him get into it, but he kind of takes on ontological arguments based on this great making notion. And their modal, like Kurt Gödel's version, deals with perfection or supreme, is a supreme being. So it totally bypasses this objection based on greatness and stuff like that. Yeah, so with that said, believe it or not, with the way I've given Eugen's thing here, I don't need any of this stuff. Forget all that. Pretend I fail and I lose. There's a third way to prove the possibility premise. That's through Eugen Nagasawa's top-down notion. So think of what a real maximally great being is by definition. It's a really maximally excellent being, and that is defined as omnipotent, omniscient, or sorry, as having knowledge, power, and benevolence, real properties demonstrated every day with human beings, to the maximal consistent set or compossible degree. Whatever that degree entails, whatever that is, that's what it is. So it's premise one is true by definition. You can't deny the truth of the premise, given Eugen's argumentation here. So yeah, I think that's it. Let me see how much time I have. 10 minutes. So just last word about parodies. So the parodies are basically parallel arguments. They kind of parallel the structure of this modal ontological argument, but they argue for absurd conclusions that the theist doesn't want to have. And I've kind of categorized it. There's three categories of parody argument here. So the first is the one that was first chronologically. You can argue for something like a maximally great insert X here, a maximally great pizza, a maximally great island, or really maximally great island or something like that. That's absurd. So, okay, shoot, I guess the modal ontological argument fails. Secondly, you have the necessary
30 seconds, Dale.
Okay, necessary plus parodies, right? So you just, whatever it is, you just add the property being necessary, and given axiom S5, it should exist. Finally, you have the what I call the canceling out parodies. So these are things like anti-ontological arguments, reverse ontological, like, you appeal to a quasi-great being or a maximal evil being, stuff like that. And we'll get into that as we go. But for now, I'll shut up.
All right. Well, Tom, it's your the floor is yours, my friend.
Okay, so the ontological argument is fundamentally flawed and one of the most terrible arguments ever, because all it's doing is defining God into existence. Sure, it's valid, but you can make a valid argument of anything. It's only playing with definitions. So because it's only playing with definitions, it's strictly analytic, and there can be no soundness. It can't be sound because it's purely analytic. So it's like it's 1 + 1 = 2. Like, all right, but that does tell us anything about the world? Nope. So you can't use the ontological argument to indicate the existence of a God, because all it's doing is justifying the definitions itself is using. Therefore, it can be nothing more than analytic. It can't ever be synthetic. It can't ever tell us something about the world, because that would be defining things into existence. And we can demonstrate this because all of the adjectives in every single version of the ontological argument are arbitrary, great, maximal, special. Doesn't matter what adjective you want to use. They're all arbitrary. You can just change the definition to anything. I can say that all of his definitions of greatness are wrong. They're all just things he got them wrong. The actual definition of greatness has to entail magical pineappleness. If it doesn't entail magical pineappleness, then it's not true greatness. It's not true maximal, not true special, not true whatever you want. It is not the truly maximal thing. Therefore, the truly maximal thing must entail magical pineappleness, which also entails no consciousness, can't be conscious. So, the true maximally great being that exists in all possible world is the magical pineapple, which isn't conscious, which disproves the Christian God, or the ontological argument he's arguing for. So you can just make up whatever alternative definition of greatness or maximal you want, say this is the thing, and then the argument will work equally as well for that, because all it's doing is circularly referencing the definition its own created to say that the thing I define as great, it must exist because I define it as great. Clearly false. And that's all I really need. I can conclude there. We can go into the open discussion.
Awesome. Well, with that said, Dale, I'm going to let you go first, and you guys can just open it up from there and discuss it however you want. We'll moderate in case we just need to get y'all on track, or if y'all lose track. But I don't expect that happening, so we're just going to kind of fade out in the background, and I'll let you start with the questions, Dale.
Okay. Okay. There was one. I got four objections from that. So thank you for making that short and concise. So the first objection I got from you is, look, you're just playing with definitions, and it's purely analytical. So with what's the problem? So I would say yes, you're allowed to do that. We're allowed to make up. Philosophers do this all the time in arguments. They make up definition. Look, God equals this, or whatever it is equals this, but through the truth of the premises, you admit they're logically valid. If so long as those premises are true and we have independent reasons for believing they're true, it doesn't matter. The conclusion is necessarily and inevitably true. You can't deny the truth of the conclusion, whether you think it's just playing with definitions or not.
Sure.
Okay.
Well, the problem is that you can just change the definition and it will always work. So like in any valid analytic argument, A equals B, B equals C, therefore C equals A. If you can fit anything you want into those letters, and it's always going to work. So I can say dogs are chickens, chickens are cats, therefore cats are dogs, and it'll still be valid. So the problem here is that if there's nothing that actually shows your definition corresponds to reality, we can replace it with any other definition, and the argument will still be equally as analytically valid. So even though your argument is valid, we can change the definition to anything we want, magical pineappleness, and it will still be equally as valid. And since both arguments work equally as well, it leads to a contradiction because both can't be true. You can't be both magical pineappleness with no consciousness and the God that you're arguing for. Therefore, the argument doesn't tell us anything about the world. It's purely definitional.
Gotcha. So I think that's true in terms of validity. But where I think your objection would fail is in terms of the soundness of the. So if we said as the possibility premise, for example, it's maximally excellent being plus necessary as I've defined it. So it's got the maximal set of power, knowledge, and thing. Plus, it's got the property being a square circle. Well, that fails. That's an unsound premise because a square circle is logically impossible. That is not a conceivable concept. And I might argue the same in terms of a magical pineapple. So remember, my definition is a minimal one. So I'm open to other properties. Obviously, as a Christian, I'm going to want to say that a real maximally great being is consistent with the truth of the Christian God. So I guess I would just need to find out, what do you mean by a magical pineapple, and would that truly be consistent with a necessary being, depending on how you define it and stuff like that?
Well, that's the point here. I define a magical pineapple as the maximally great being, and you can't show that that's incorrect. You can only say, I disagree with that definition, which is just your opinion, and there's no evidence for it, which means you can't show soundness of the argument because it's purely analytic. It's just definitional. There's no truth to it when it corresponds to reality because it doesn't correspond to anything. You're just saying there is a letter X, and X exists because I think it has the property of existence. It's not how it works.
Well, this pineapple, through the truth of the argument, it would also have to be omniscient.
Nope. That's your definition of maximal, not in mine, and I think yours is false. Yours is false. Prove your definition entails omniscience.
Okay, so you're just saying, so a real maximally great being is just a magical pineapple. That's the only property it has.
The only one I need for now.
Okay, so can a pineapple be eaten?
Yes. Only the maximally great being must necessarily be eaten. If it can't be eaten, it can't be maximally great.
Great. So then that's an incoherent definition because
No, it's perfectly coherent.
no, because it can't be, by definition, it can't be necessary then, and it can't exist in all possible worlds.
No, it can be necessary and exist in all possible worlds and be eaten. There's no contradiction there.
No, because the concept of being eaten entails that it stops existing. So
no, it doesn't.
When we talk,
wait. Let me address right there. So okay. I can eat a gold brick. The gold brick is still there. So it doesn't entail it's not existing. So you can eat objects and have them still exist just fine. So just eating them does not entail them not existing. That's your false assumption. And so the magical pineapple can be eaten. It doesn't stop existing. You taste it just fine. It makes you satisfied and hungry and makes you lose weight. It still exists and it doesn't stop existing. And you can eat it as many times as you want in all possible worlds. So your assumption there is false. You have falsely assumed that somehow in this definition of being eaten, it entails that it be destroyed, and that's false.
Gotcha. So I would just okay. So you mean he just swallows it? It's kind of like Zeus's daddy. He just
No,
swallows them.
it's a magical pineapple. It can actually go into your stomach. It can be dissolved and still exist at the same time because it has a multi-dimensional state, to steal the gin quotes. So
Okay. Yeah. So I would just say that's you're not talking about a pineapple at this point.
no, it's still a pineapple. So your definition of pineapple here doesn't matter. It's my pineapple, not your pineapple. So
Okay. Well, I can conceive of circumstances where this magical pineapple doesn't exist, and if you keep playing with the definition, it's kind of going into like Lewis Wolpart thing,
I
right? Where
can
you just
conceive
keep
where the Christian God doesn't exist.
so is okay. Well, that's a good point. So I would just say, look, with the pineapple, there are circumstances that are conceivable where this thing doesn't exist.
And
Like
with
for
the Christian
example,
God, there are circumstances where the Christian God doesn't exist. So that applies to both. So if you think that's a
okay,
defeater, that applies to defeater to your ontological argument as well.
gotcha. So I think this is the best objection that you raised in our first talk. And I would just say, so in the first place, my answer is still the same. No, you can't. So I think what you're saying, you're just asserting that you can prima facie perhaps conceive of a possible world without the Christian God,
Well,
right? So
it's not prima facie. Like I can imagine the God of the Zeus world could be real, no Christian God. The Hindu world could be real, no Christian God. There could be the atheist world could be real, no God at all. There could be many gods. There could be something higher than a God. Mormonism could be true. All of those things are conceivable, and not only conceivable, have been conceived. Therefore, it's demonstrated, QED, yes, there are worlds that can be imagined without the Christian God, no problem.
well, so definitely there are possible worlds with Zeus and with these pagan created gods. The Hindu gods are created, by the way. So that's not inconsistent
All
with the
gods are created, just so you know.
not by definition, by this real maximally great being by definition is logically necessary. He's not created. He is the ultimate creator, right? So
No. By my definition, the maximally great being is a pineapple. All gods, in my definition, all gods are created. But like, it's a property of the maximally great being that all gods are created. Therefore, the maximally great being can't be a god because it can't be created.
gotcha. But with the pineapple, right? So in the first place, the ontological argument could be maybe there's a real maximally great being and there's this magical pineapple. But this magical pineapple
No,
doesn't.
because this magical pineapple is the real maximally great being. There can't be any others. This is the true maximally great. There can be no alternative maximally greats because if it lacks the magical pineapple property, it can't be it can't be maximal at all. Because to be maximal, by definition, it must entail magical pineappleness.
Well, yeah, but that's so okay. So I would just deny your definition then, or I would accept it and say, fine, call my modal ontological argument. Call him what was the fluffinophagus being. Doesn't matter what definitional label we give. There's still a being that has
No,
these
remember,
properties.
magical pineappleness entails can't be conscious, can't be omniscient, no mind. So by definition, your entire worldview is defeated. So this ontological argument, if it holds, my definition, it necessarily violates yours, and yours is defeated.
Okay, so this magical pineapple. So this is why I wanted you to define it. So it's really kind of a negative ontological argument. You're just kind of saying like
Well, it's
the
still
magical
positive, it's just
pineapple.
for an alternative definition of maximal.
Yeah, but its property, the property of magical pineappleness entails that there is no real maximal being as I define it. That's what you're saying, right?
Right, because
Did
its
I understand?
properties are different from your properties. So it's not a
Right.
negative, it's just saying it has different properties than yours.
Gotcha. Okay, so that would be an example of a canceling out parity argument, and it basically just comes down to number one, which of the premises do we find more plausible? And I've provided three. Well, because when you have a similar structure of an argument, and
Well, the
we've
argument's the
admitted,
exact same. So we're using the exact same argument, we're just changing the definition of maximal. So the argument is exactly identical in both cases. We're just changing the presuppositions of the argument of what the definition of maximal means.
exactly. So you have these two parallel arguments. We've both admitted that my argument is valid. So the parity can only show that in some way my possibility premise is unsound. It's not true. And in that case, we just have to go by, well, based on the evidence, the independent reasons for accepting my premise one over your magical pineapple possibility premise. And I've given 3 ways of going that. So there's that a priori conceivability thing.
Wait, go, like explain them one at a time. So a priori conceivability, how is that an argument for yours, not the magical pineapple? Because I can conceive of a great, maximally great magical pineapple, and my audience can conceive of a magically great magical pineapple. So it's conceivable as well in all possible worlds.
Well, your magical pineapple is just a negative property that
No, it's not. It's not a negative property. I'm giving it that just so that to make sure that you understand it's not the same. Magical pineappleness has no consciousness in it. That's not a negative property. It just has the property of magical pineappleness, not the property of consciousness. So it's not a negative property. I'm just using that as a way to explain to you that it's different from yours.
Gotcha. So let me put it this way: with the magical pineapple, are there any circumstances at all that you can conceive of? And I'm talking about not prima facie warranted conception. You seem to understand the difference, or what Lewis calls ideal, or Chalmers, sorry, calls like ideal conceivability or something. Are there any circumstances where the laws of logic are true, but that magical pineapple, doesn't exist?
No,
at any
it exists
time?
in all possible worlds.
At all times.
Yep.
Okay, so you're just saying it's logically necessary then.
Yes.
Okay. Sorry.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, the only difference between the magical pineapple and your definition is the consciousness part.
Okay, so this is where I would appeal possibly again to the conceptions. If you're saying you personally just can't conceive of that because you can conceive of knowledge, right? Beings have knowledge. This is a property beings have, right?
Sure. Some of them, not all of them.
Doesn't matter. So some beings have property of knowledge, having property of knowledge.
Yes.
And
Some beings have the
degrees.
property of hunger, and some beings have the property of mass.
Cool. Are there degrees of knowledge? Do some people have more knowledge?
Just like there's degrees of mass.
Okay, cool. So given my Eugen Nagasawa's top-down approach, he would just say, well, there's got to be a finite, there's got to be a maximal compossible or consistent set of knowledge a person can have.
I don't know what that means. Like, I could say there's a maximum amount of mass a thing can have.
Is there a maximum knowledge? Let's pretend it's just knowing the true propositions or something, right? People know more true propositions compared to others. So on that basis, there's a maximal degree. I can conceive of a being that has the maximum amount of true propositions in his head and knows them.
No, there could be an infinite amount. So saying there's a maximum amount of true propositions could be like there's a maximum amount of mass. There could just be an infinite amount or a biggest number. So that could just be false, but it's not relevant.
Okay, well, I would just come back with that and say, well, there is no such thing as an actual quantifiable infinite. I know that's more an argument for the cosmological argument, but that's how I would kind of respond to that and say, no, there is a finite set.
The universe is literally infinite, but that's again not relevant to your argument.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, and there is a potential infinite. Just to clarify for the viewers, there's a finite set of true propositions that a being can know at any given time, because obviously the future is potentially infinite. So, there is a potential infinite of propositions, but that's beside the point, as TJump saying. Okay, what about the second way? Some people provide a posteriori reasons or arguments that prove the omniscience of God and stuff like that. So, for example, one example would be Richard Swinburne, again, kind of what I just did with you. Like, he will say, well, there is this property of knowledge. We know that there are different degrees, and it's simpler to posit there's a being with this maximal compossible set.
No, it's definitely not. So it's definitely not simpler to imagine an all-powerful being who knows everything than to imagine just nature. Nature is simpler by definition. So nature plus God, less simple than nature. And infinitely powerful God who knows infinitely many facts is infinitely more complicated. So all Swinburne done is invert the definition of simplicity to mean it's the exact opposite of what it actually means. And by doing that, again, you could just mirror the argument and say the simplest thing is the magical pineapple, because that's just how I'm going to define simplicity now, because it's the universe plus the magical pineapple. Just arbitrary definition of simplicity.
Well, this magical the way the Swinburne's simplicity argument, and Caleb Miller is another philosopher who argues similarly and much more. There's different conceptions of simplicity, right? And in terms of ontological simplicity, with these properties that I'm asserting in this argument, it's simpler to just assume that it's up to the potentially infinite degree, or the maximal consistent degree, rather than some mixture of a finite degree here versus a higher or lower degree here. Um, that's what he's trying to say, is that it's simpler in that respect.
Yeah, but that again doesn't make any sense. It's just arbitrary. You can arbitrarily define anything you want as simplicity and say, oh, because I've defined this to be simplicity, that therefore it's more likely to be correspond to reality. It's just changing definitions again. So I can just change the definition of simplicity to be the pineapple. Only pineapples are perfectly simple. The magical pineapple is the perfectly simple thing. Therefore, anything that isn't the magical pineapple is arbitrarily complex by comparison.
Gotcha. Yeah, and again, with that magical pineapple thing, it's just you're giving an incomplete definition. What you're really talking about is God, is the real maximal
No,
being.
remember, it can't be conscious, so that's false. That I've already debunked that argument like 4 times.
Yeah. Okay. So here's another a posteriori argument for the omniscience. So the consciousness. So you're giving like a quasi great being. He's thing. The magical pineapple is
No,
everything.
yours is the quasi great being. Mine is the true maximally great being. There can only be a true magically great being of the pineapple. It doesn't have the magical pineapple property. Can't be a true magically great being. Everything else is a quasi magically great being, like what you think the Christian God is. It's quasi magically great.
Okay. Cool. So as long as I can prove that this thing is conscious, that will defeat your parity argument.
Sure.
So okay. So what about this argument that some philosophers have given? So premise number one: abstract objects like numbers and propositions are either independently existing realities, or else they exist as mental thoughts or concepts in some mind. Premise two: abstract objects are not independently existing realities. So therefore, if abstract objects are thoughts in a mind or some kind of mental entity, then an omniscient, metaphysically necessary being exists, because propositions and numbers are necessary truths. So it would require a necessary mind to know them, and it would have to be omniscient. He would have to ground all of the true propositions. So therefore, it's got to be omniscient. Your magical pineapple, by definition, is not a conscious, omniscient entity.
Your argument is obviously false. Like, abstract objects don't exist. They are a product of minds to describe the way reality is, and all they are is representations of existing things within the mind. So they don't exist in the way that you described them. It's just false.
Well, don't they exist as thoughts in the mind?
Yes, as material thoughts in a material brain.
Well, okay, so why would we assume it has to be a material brain?
Because that's what all of the evidence in every academic field indicates.
Well, no, it doesn't. There's lots of arguments that prove that substance dualism is true. I know
I said evidence, not arguments. Arguments are just making stuff up. So evidence are like novel testable predictions, the entire consensus in the field of neurology, psychology, neuroscience, cognitive science, everything related to the brain. The percent of dualists is in the single digits for philosophers and single digits for physicists. There is no evidence that actually indicates dualism at all. So if we are going to go with the evidence says it's physical.
Gotcha. So I would just disagree. You got to consult philosophers of mind. I actually took a course with Dr. David Hunter about this, and he knows the scholarship. So there's lots of evidence.
Why would I ask them? Like, neurologists are the experts. Philosophers don't get an opinion. Well, science overrides philosophy, not the other way around.
No. Well, it depends. If we're talking about what the facts are, right? So neuroscience can only ever prove either correlative states or causation states. You know, a certain brain state causes this, but it can't prove the metaphysical nature of a mental state that we're having, or a sensation that we're having, or what a thought is. It can't prove that our thoughts are identical to some brain state. It can only ever.
Well, it can support evidence for it, just like we can support evidence that we're not in the matrix. We can support evidence that the brain is physical. All the evidence we indicate says that we're not in the matrix, that there's a physical world around us, and that brains are physical. There's no other evidence that exists.
Gotcha. So in the same way, I would say the evidence can support the substance dualism hypothesis or thesis, and that's where the arguments come in. How well, which is the best explanation? Like I said, there's several arguments that. This is off topic, so sorry, guys. Yeah, I can see.
Well, I mean, again, all of the evidence can be indicate the fact that we're in the matrix too, but that's the less supported hypothesis for the same reason, which is why the vast majority of academics in every academic field say we're brains, not minds.
Gotcha. Okay, but it doesn't prove it. Okay, well, how about this then?
We don't need to prove. We just need what does the more evidence indicate. Like the more evidence indicates we're not in the matrix by a 99.99%, and the more evidence indicates we're physical brains by 99.9%. We don't need 100% certainty to count it as knowledge. It can still be knowledge that we're physical brains, even without 100% certainty. So I don't know why you keep bringing up certainty.
Right. So here's why I would say that. So, um, you've given me that what we call abstract objects can exist as mental entities, as thoughts, and you've added the qualifier they've got to be physical brains. So I would just say, well, physical brains have limitations, right? They can't know. Do you think that a physical brain can know all necessary truths?
I don't think any brain can know all facts at all due to like basic problems of Gödel's incompleteness theorem and the similar related problems, Wittgenstein's paradox of omniscience. It's literally impossible to know all facts, even if you are an omniscient mind. It's just impossible. So omniscience entails logical contradictions, and it's not possible for the necessary being to be omniscient. It literally cannot be.
Oh well.
Let me interject here, guys, real quick, because I want to give Tom a chance to lead the argument as well.
I'm happy with this. This is fine with me.
Okay. If you're happy with it, then we'll continue.
Because mine would just be okay. Provide a reason to think your definition is true, because you haven't. Or none of all the reasons you've provided so far are false. Do you have any others?
Well, I would say that they're not false. You're just asserting that they're false, right? So,
Well, no, like I think I've demonstrated they're false just in this conversation. It's pretty easy to show they're false because all you're doing is playing with definitions. I just changed the definition, and then all you have is more definitions to try and justify your previous definitions. And so I can just make up new definitions to justify my definitions. And you got nothing. So the only thing kind of evidence you could provide would be empirical. You need novel testable predictions. And until that, your arguments are always just going to fail because I can just replace your arguments with a mirrored argument with a new definition.
yeah, but then the mirrored definitions either fail because they're not structurally the same or they're not dialectically the same as
No, they're
each
exactly
one's-
identical. So they work exactly the same way and exactly as well in every case necessarily because all I'm doing is changing the noun. So they all necessarily work. You can't ever definitionally indicate any evidence because they're always going to work since they're only analytic. Until you can have some kind of verification in the external world to make it more than analytic, then yeah, every counter argument is going to work equally as well necessarily because it's also just analytic.
Okay, so all right, so I'm going to go back to you said all my arguments fail. So you've actually conceded defeat when you admitted that there is the property of knowledge, beings have different degrees of it, and given Eugen Nagasawa's top-down approach,
Which is
it
false. So his model is
is
obviously false. But I mean, again, the fact that we have mass doesn't mean that there's a maximum thing of having mass. The fact that we have knowledge and that there's degrees of knowledge is no different than the fact that there's mass and we have degrees of mass. Is the maximally great being the fattest of all beings because we have degrees of mass? Clearly not.
Dale, can I jump in real fast with some moderator privilege and just ask for both of your all's, I guess, clarifications as far as how you're defining maximally great, or at least I know that Dale is throwing that term around. So Dale, are you thinking more in lines of like how Josh Rasmussen would say with like lacking arbitrary limits, or how exactly what do you define greatness as a property?
So the property would be real maximal greatness, and it's clearly defined in the argument. And so it's not necessarily, oh, it has all the great making properties to whatever maximal degree. I'm actually defining it technically as it has power, knowledge, and benevolence, all properties that we know exist from human beings, to the maximum consistent degree or the maximally consistent degree. That's a minimal definition. Maybe it's got omnipresence too, but the argument doesn't care about that. It just argues for these three properties. So a real maximally great being is one that has these three properties to the maximally consistent degree, whatever that degree is, plus metaphysical necessity. So it's four properties really, minimally.
And so, Tom, are you saying that the idea of greatness in this way can't really be defined like objectively? It just seems semantics to you. That's arbitrary.
Yeah, like, and you can make up any definition you want and submit it and as an alternative definition, and it will be equally as justified and equally as reasonable in all cases as the definition that he has provided.
Okay. I just wanted clarification at that point. So I'll let Dale go ahead and finish what his point was that he was getting to earlier.
Do you remember what I was? I think we kind of finished it. Like I brought up the point from before, the argument from before that I hear, with all due respect, I hear Tom Jump conceding defeat. Although he did say that it's just so we've got knowledge to degrees, and there it makes sense to say there's a maximal compossible degree that a thing can have. And you said that's not the case. Why couldn't that be the case? Why is that impossible?
Well, it's like saying there's a maximum degree of mass, like where the maximum number. There's not a highest number. Like even if it was the case that there was a highest number, that doesn't mean that the highest number would be entailed in the necessary being. So it doesn't make a difference. Like this argument from continuation is irrelevant. It doesn't in any way provide evidence for or against the properties of what the necessary being are. It's completely arbitrary.
It's so in terms of the definition, yeah, with the possibility premise, it is an arbitrary definition. It is Eugen Nagasawa's definition. But the other premises of the argument say that, look, once we understand what the definition is, that's what ontological arguments are, is they take the definition on a conceptual basis, they prove, number one, that it's possible, and then from that, through the other premises, that proves that it must actually exist. It's undeniable. Once you grant that first premise, then it follows right through.
Which follows no matter what you change the definition to be. That's the problem, is that it works for literally anything that you change the definition to be. So
No, it
which would
does.
lead to alternatives like the magical pineapple.
No, but it doesn't work for anything, right? So you've kind of gotten yourself.
No, I could say it's a square circle and it would work equally as well. Like we can literally make up whatever definition you want. It just, all I need to show is that there's one thing that it could work in a different way, and to demonstrate that they could work in any possible way. So for example, if I say it's a magical pineapple, which isn't conscious, that shows that the consciousness property of yours is arbitrary, but I can make all of them arbitrary. I can say a maximally great being is a square circle. And that would work equally as well. You coming up with ad hoc reasons why you think it doesn't work isn't evidence. Like you saying, oh, well, or pizza, take the pizza, for example. You said pizza can be eaten, therefore a pizza can't be maximally great, because then it wouldn't necessarily exist in all possible worlds. Well, that's false. I can just say, nope, your conception of maximally great is wrong. Maximally great is actually existing in all worlds until it's eaten. And that would be equally as coherent. So, like, again, the fact that you just made up a definition of arbitrary criterion of what can and can't qualify as that definition is totally just a word game. There's no, until you can demonstrate that anything a part of your definition corresponds to reality with empirical evidence, it's just making up definitions.
So no, that's absolutely wrong. Ask anyone with a PhD, atheist in modal logic. Everyone, virtually everyone, agrees with the validity and soundness of how this works, right?
No. Remember, I'm granting both of those things. The definition, you can change it to anything you want. It will still be valid and it will still be sound. And that everyone in the philosophy agrees with too, other than the theists.
No, they don't.
They do. They definitely do. So the whole point is that this is defining things into existence. That's like the main criticism of why no one takes this seriously in philosophy other than theists. It's just defining things into existence. You change the definition, you're defining a new thing into existence.
So you're correct that parodies are the number one objection, right? Because most people can't figure out what is wrong with it, because there is nothing wrong with it.
No. The objection that everyone in philosophy agrees with that isn't a theist is that you're just making stuff up and you're making up a definition. So if we change the definition, it works equally as well. That's the part that we're just like, yeah, I can make it a square circle, it works equally as well. Or a magical pineapple works equally as well. That's the reason parity arguments are the same, is because all you're doing is using analytic logic to define your thing into existence. And we can just define anything else into existence in the exact same way, and it'll be equally as valid and equally as sound. It's just an analytic argument. So it's basic fallacy of composition to use an analytic argument to try and justify a synthetic conclusion about reality. It doesn't work that way.
Okay, so it does. And let me use your square circle example to prove why you're wrong.
Sure.
So okay, cool. So when we say that something's logically necessary, for example, or even logically possible, it means that there's a condition. The laws of logic, like the logical law of non-contradiction, is true. those givens entail that it's necessary that this square circle exists. Or if we're talking about contingent things, that it's possible that a square circle exists in the same world where the logical law of non-contradiction is true. A square circle, by definition, violates the logical law of non-contradiction. It can't exist in any possible world where the logical law of non-contradiction is true. So you're
That's
wrong.
fine.
We would deny premise one.
Right.
Premise
I
one
can
is
just
false.
say, and I can just say a maximally great being, a true maximally great being, that, as opposed to your quasi maximally great being, is only one that can violate the law of non-contradiction. If it doesn't, it's not a truly maximally great being.
So sorry, say that again. You said that really fast.
A true maximally great being is only one that violates the law of non-contradiction. So if it doesn't violate the law of non-contradiction, it can't be a truly maximally great being. It's only a quasi maximally great being, and therefore it wouldn't exist in all possible worlds.
A true maximally great being is only one that must violate the logical law of non-contradiction. Great. Yep. So you're saying that there's a logical possible world where a being violates the laws of where the laws of logic aren't true. No,
it doesn't even matter if it's the case. So I can say I can make a logical contradiction in the definition of maximally great. I can say maximally greatness is a thing that exists in no possible worlds and a thing that exists in all possible worlds. Therefore, no maximally great being could ever exist. And I can say that that's the true definition of maximally great, and it's equally as coherent as yours, or equally likely to be true as yours. So if I just pick anything like square, circle, or logical contradictions, that definition of maximally great is equally as likely to correspond to reality as yours, even if it has a logical contradiction in it.
Yeah, so I would just say no. This is a metaphysically impossible premise. It's not feasible for such.
But that doesn't matter. Like, the point here is that the definition that's metaphysically impossible that I've made up is equally as likely to be correct in reality as yours. That's the point, is you're just making up definitions of what you conceive of or what you think you can conceive of. Reality doesn't care. Until you can actually demonstrate your definition that you've made up corresponds to reality, then it's no different from me making up a logical contradiction and saying it's true about reality.
No, it's totally different, right? Oh. So in terms of let me try to explain why. So in terms of the definitional point, you're correct. You can define, it's your argument. You can define anything you want. If you want to define something, a square circle, it's possible that a necessary square circle exists or something. Cool. And you can give it whatever label you want.
Yep.
Great. Awesome. I understand. But then when we're evaluating the soundness of your first premise, it is metaphysically possible or logically possible that this necessary square circle exists. That premise is demonstrably false. It violates the logical law of non-contradiction. Things that violate the logical law of non-contradiction can't be true. There are no possible worlds where they exist. Even if you define it, it exists in no worlds and it exists in all worlds, that's gobbledygook.
Well, that's not the objection here. The objection here is which definition is correct. Whether or not, like, the fact that my definition isn't possible or couldn't be such a thing doesn't make a difference. The fact that yours could doesn't make a difference. The question is which one's correct? Which one does this property of maximal greatness actually correspond to in reality outside of our opinions? Because if I have an opinion that it's the square circle definition, you have the opinion it's the God definition, which one of our opinions is correct? The fact that one may or may not be able to exist in reality is irrelevant. It doesn't tell us the truth of which definition is correct. Like, pineapples could exist in reality. Does that mean pineapples are magically great, like a physical pineapple? No. Mm-hmm. The fact that it's possible doesn't tell us which one is more likely to be true. It just tells us which one you can conceive of or which one you like better.
Okay, so believe it or not, from the perspective of philosophers who use this argument, this is exactly backwards. There are no correctness conditions for the definitions. You can define anything you want, any way you want for an argument, right?
Right.
So it doesn't matter my definition is true, your definition is true, but it only matters, is it metaphysically possible? Is that first premise, is whatever your definition is that possible? And you're saying, yes, my necessary square circle is metaphysically impossible. Premise one, unsound failure. With my argument, my real maximum great being, that's not the case. That is metaphysically possible, and therefore the argument takes over, so your parity fails.
Well, again, that doesn't matter. Like, nothing about that matters here. The question is does the property, the definition that you gave, actually correspond to reality? So, like, I can make up a definition of the law of gravity. The law of gravity is magical puffins. And Einstein says, no, the law of gravity is curvature of space-time. What matters here is which one of our definitions corresponds to reality. What is the definition reality gives to greatness? Not you, not me. We can make up our own definitions, but what is the definition reality gives? Now, if the definition reality gives agrees with me that a maximally great being is a square circle and it's not possible to exist in any possible worlds, then your definition is wrong. And if reality defines maximally great being in the way yours does, then my definition is wrong. But until we can actually figure out the way reality defines it, your opinion and my opinion are exactly equal. So the question here is, how do you show the definition reality is using? Because I don't want your definition, because it doesn't matter, because it's no more likely to be true than my definition. How do we show reality's definition is one way or the other?
Gotcha. Okay, so sorry, I was misunderstanding. I thought you were still on premise one. So you're kind of can accept premise one, but how do we go about showing that reality has adjudicated this one is true or not? And that's where premises 2 through 5 get us to that conclusion that God actually exists. So if I've got this metaphysically possible arbitrary definition that I've made up, and so therefore it's possibly necessary, that's premise one. Okay, well then that means it exists in every possible world. That's just what logical necessity means. Every world where the laws of logic are true, this thing necessarily exists. It's needed to exist. If it exists in every possible world, then it exists in the actual world. And if it exists in the actual world, it exists. So that's how reality adjudicates through this mode of logic.
That argument works for the square circle thing too, because it just wouldn't exist in reality and it wouldn't exist. And so the conclusion, that whole argument would still be equally as valid and equally as sound under either case. Even if it's a square circle, if it doesn't exist in reality, then it wouldn't exist. So the argument would still be perfectly valid, because the conclusion isn't the thing exists in reality. It's just it's possible to exist in reality. If it doesn't, then it doesn't exist in reality.
So it's true through Axiom S5 and stuff. You can just slap the word necessary on anything, right? So necessary square circle, necessary line, or whatever. And premises 2 through 5 would get you to say, okay, whatever is necessarily or possibly necessary is necessary. That's what that Axiom S5 is all about. But then it will come back to premise 1, and I'm just going to flat out deny you. I know that you say it's irrelevant, but it's not.
That's not irrelevant. The whole point is here, I'm doing the exact same thing to you. Like, your definition is just made up.
Yeah, but that's not a problem.
It is a bit. So the main problem is here is, if you can't show the difference between imagination and reality, then it's just your imagination and nothing more.
Well, the way we do that is by showing, look, it's this made up definition is possible. Okay, great.
In your imagination.
Premise, in a possible world.
In your imagination. That's what possible world means. It's in your imagination.
Well, there's a difference between imaginability and conceivability, but yes, I get what you're saying. For the sake of argument, imaginability, great. But then we have premise 2, right? So then it exists in some possible world in your imagination. Premise 3 comes in. Well, because it's a possibly necessary thing in this one possible world, well, necessary means it exists in every possible world where the laws of logic are true. And then if it exists in every possible world, it exists in the actual world. So bada boom, bada bing, we've got this real maximally great being.
Well, it obviously fails again, because I can just define it differently. Another way to show it fails is to say there is no maximally great being. Okay. Like I could say that there is a world where this it exists in every world but one. This one, it doesn't exist. Therefore, the maximally great being is false.
Well, so you would just be saying, okay, there's this really maximally excellent being that's possible. It exists in all possible worlds except for one. In that case, yeah, the modal ontological argument wouldn't work, right? Because Axiom S5 wouldn't apply to it, where it's not necessary by definition.
Yep.
So cool. So what? Yeah, there are.
So if we can imagine one world, one imaginary possible world where this thing doesn't exist, then your argument's defeated. And I've already done that. Like, most atheists do that every day.
No, but the argument isn't defeated. I mean, there are lots of contingent beings that are lesser, that are not necessary. There's Satan. He's got a lot of property. He's very powerful. He's very knowledgeable.
Wait. So the argument is that if I can imagine one world with no necessary being in it, or that it exists in all possible worlds except one, that's now conceivable. So it is conceivable that there is a maximally excellent being and no maximally necessary being. Therefore, it is conceivable to imagine a world without a necessary being.
So I would just say, so if there's a possible world where the laws of logic are true. There's these logical laws. You've agreed with me that there are no abstract things. They only can exist as propositions can only exist as thoughts or mental entities. How can there be nothing in that world? There's got to be at least a mind that's
Yeah, there's
sustaining
like
or grounding
just naturalism, no God. People are in it, everything except God. So it has all of the stuff that a world has exactly like ours, no God.
Okay. So yeah, again, it just comes down to the fact that it's not. So it's Yeah. So I would just say it's impossible. These kind of like anti-ontological arguments where you're trying to say, well, it's possible that there is no really maximally great being or something like that that's grounding it or something. There's just reality. Yeah, I would just appeal to the fact that there are so many arguments that prove that there has to be a being like that with those properties.
No, I've proven all of them false so far, but so again, it's all I have to show is that it's logically possible to imagine that there is. I can just grant your God exists in all but one possible worlds, and one possible worlds. If it's even conceivable, if it's possible to even imagine it in my imagination, your argument is defeated. So anyone who can imagine a world without a God has defeated your argument, and most people can do that. In fact, the vast majority of humans who have ever lived have all done that.
Yeah, but you can't. So okay, so I would just say the conceiving of contingent beings does nothing to disprove the modal ontological argument in the first place, right? So the modal ontological.
I didn't say that. I said if they can imagine a world without a God, that's all. That's all they have to do.
Gotcha.
And they've done it.
So that's the second thing I was going to say. So just asserting that you're saying basically you can conceive of a world, a logically possible world, where a logically necessary being does not exist, and I would just say that's impossible. No, you can't.
Well, I mean,
I guess I would say.
Well, you did it. It's called a maximally excellent being who is not maximally necessary. To have a maximally excellent being, that means it can't be maximally excellent necessary, because then it would only be two different things. So if you can conceive of a maximally excellent being, then you've conceived of a world without a maximally necessary being. And if it's conceivable, then it's means that the maximally necessary, you've conceived of a world without a maximally necessary being debunked.
No, because the maximally great being is still conceivable too. He's in that same world and they cancel each other out. A quasi great being can't exist, or a contingent maximally excellent being can't exist in the same world as a maximally great being.
Well, it doesn't matter. All it has to be is imaginable. So if it's imaginable that there is a maximally excellent being, but no maximally necessary being, then the maximally necessary being, by your definition, has been debunked. And it is imaginable. I can imagine a God in all possible worlds but one, which is grounded in reality. I can also imagine one with a different necessary being in each, who isn't maximally necessary, just the necessary grounds of that particular universe, both of which debunk your argument. Like, this is super easy.
well, let me try this. Can you also conceive in your head of my definition of a real maximally great being? Is that logically possible? Does that exist in some possible world as well?
Can I conceive of your definition? I mean, I guess, maybe.
Okay. So if you can, then that proves these are canceling parities. So that proves that by definition, your maximally excellent being that exists in all worlds except for one can't exist, because there's this really maximally great being that you have kind of tentatively admitted is.
So if you can imagine a contrary definition that overrides the previous definition, that it's the defeater, yes?
Yeah, parities can count as defeaters.
So if you imagine an alternative definition of maximal that doesn't have consciousness, that's a defeater, isn't it?
Well,
Thank you for granting my original argument.
Right, if it actually worked, but the problem is these things are logically incoherent alternative definitions, and therefore they don't work. They're no defeat the modal ontological argument.
Well, two things. First is that your definition of a God is logically contradictory. All of the properties, omniscience, omnibenevolence, all powerful, all of those are logically contradictory properties. Secondly, my pineapple isn't. There's nothing logically contradictory about my magical pineapple property.
Interesting. Okay, so in what way, in the first place, your objection is totally irrelevant, but I'm just going to play with it for a second. In what way are omniscience, omnipotence, and omnibenevolence contradictory?
Can God create a rock so heavy he can't lift it? If no, he's not omniscient and not omnipotent. Omniscience, for God to know everything, can he know, like, I forget what the actual example is. There was a logical paradox presented something like the liar's paradox and Russell's paradox for knowledge, and Wittgenstein's problem of omniscience. It shows that it's impossible to actually know every proposition. So we know Gödel's incompleteness theorem proves God can't have omniscience, so omniscience is itself a logical contradiction.
Gotcha. Okay, so in that case, it comes down to, well, what do these properties entail? And remember, Eugen, a real maximally great being, has these properties to whatever the maximally consistent degree is possible. So whatever that is, that is definitely conceivable by definition, right? So it doesn't have, we don't have to go from the bottom up and say, well, omnipotence would entail you have the power to make a rock so big you can't do it, or something like that. But again, how do we define omnipotence, right? This is just, you have the power to do everything that is logically possible to do in order to be consistent with the laws of logic. Omniscience, how do we define that? You have all of the, all of the true propositions that it is logically possible for you to know. So God doesn't have all forms of knowledge. He doesn't have experiential knowledge.
Before you said an omniscient being is one who knows all true propositions. But now you're saying
time. Sorry.
Right. So, but now you're saying that's not the case, because there can be true propositions that he doesn't know. That's kind of the point of the paradox of omniscience and Gödel's incompleteness theorem. So there are true propositions he can't know. That means he can't be omniscient. That's a logical contradiction. Therefore, your property is equally as coherent as a square circle.
And do you mind explaining? So I can imagine, I was just going to say, there are true propositions that don't exist at a time, but come into existence in the future on an A theory of time.
This is just at any given time, God cannot know all true facts.
And what's the reasoning behind that?
Gödel's incompleteness theorem, the P or NP problem, all of the different problems that show you literally can't, due to Russell's paradox, have that knowledge.
Well, with incompleteness theorem, from my understanding, you can, as long as you it's just saying, look, you have to have certain axioms. God can know whether these axioms are, there's a fact of the matter about the logical law of non-contradiction, for example, or certain axioms which form the foundation for the rest of derivative propositions. So yeah, God can know those at any given time.
No, God can't solve the problem of omniscience that way. That doesn't even work to solve the problem of omniscience. Just saying you have axioms doesn't actually solve it, because it has nothing to do with axioms. Like the P or NP problem says there are certain problems, certain questions you can't answer. It's not about axioms. It's irrelevant to the axioms. It's way after the axioms.
Gotcha. Okay. All right, cool. So with Eugen Nagasawa, let's just say, for the sake of argument, because I don't know what you're talking about, so I do need to research on that front, but let's pretend that's true. Nagasawa's argument still defeats you, because it just says, look, he has all knowledge to the maximal possible degree. Great. So if there's certain true propositions that it's not possible for an omniscient being to know, cool. Omniscience is defined as whatever is possible for him to know.
Okay, and we can just say maximal greatness doesn't have knowledge. It's just an arbitrary thing that you've made up. There's no reason to think it has knowledge.
Well, why would that be? I mean, knowledge is defined
as it have knowledge. Like the fact that you assume that maximal greatness entails knowledge is arbitrary.
Yeah, but I've proven that arbitrary concept exists through the modal ontological argument. And
yes, and I have an arbitrary concept to which it doesn't have knowledge, and it also exists through the modal ontological argument.
No, it doesn't. Like that square circle, it fails the first premise.
Square circle. The pineapple?
Your
no, the pineapple.
Necessary square circle, or the magical pineapple.
Magical pineapple doesn't in any way. So the magical pineapple, no knowledge, no consciousness, can exist conceptually just fine as maximally great being. No logical contradictions. So.
Yeah, but we know that knowledge does exist, so it would need ultimate ground. So those true propositions would need grounding in something, and by definition, it has to be a mind, according to you, because there are no abstract Platonic things.
Knowledge is a result of an emergent property of physical processes, so it's grounded in reality. There's no mind required to ground knowledge. The consensus in every field of brain science.
Gotcha. Okay.
Dale, can I ask for another clarification?
Yeah. What?
Oh, sorry, David. Are you going to say
no,
something?
Go ahead. I was just going to wrap it up here in a second to do questions.
Yeah, you're good. Yeah,
from the audience.
If there were questions from the audience. No, I was going to ask Dale. So, because you're talking about knowledge is like a prerequisite for maximal greatness, is another way, because when I had first heard this, I more imagined that it was like freedom. So could you say that it is better to be free than not be free, and that in order to have libertarian freedom in that sense, you would have to have some kind of will and intention, and that would imply a conscious agent. Is that more so what you're getting at, or no?
Yeah, I think you could work that way and work that into the definition as well. Like remember, my definition of a really maximally great being is a minimal definition. So it can include the Trinity, it can include omnipresence, it can include freedom of the will, and all these other things. Obviously, again, it would need to be these properties would all need to be coherent and consistent in their maximal compossible degrees with all the other set of properties. But it's just for the sake of argument, we like Plantinga and that kind of like arbitrarily define it as the minimally, it's at least these three properties, and that's good enough to get it off the ground. If you want to add other stuff after the fact, like freedom and stuff, cool. Does that answer your question, Caleb? Or yeah, okay.
Right on. Well, guys, we're gonna like bring this to a close here because we're a little over an hour right now, and I'm just gonna do quick questions from the audience. We only got a couple, so the first one's for you, Dale.
Okay. I was just gonna ask TJump how did. Okay, so
when it's something that is limited to only ever be able to produce our universe be simpler than one with free will that could create anything?
Well, so it depends on, I guess, what you mean by simpler, right? So like if you're meaning simpler in the sense of how many component parts or ad hoc hypotheses or something like that, and that's kind of the way TJump is approaching it. But there's also this metaphysically simple, just a single soul that has all these causal powers and creates the universe is very ontologically simple and metaphysically simple. So that's what most theists mean when they refer to God being the simplest being and that sort of thing. Yeah, hopefully that answers that question there.
Tom, you want to comment on that one?
Yeah, it would definitely be simpler for a being, for just like a quantum particle or something to create the universe than a being with free will. And it'd obviously be simpler than an all powerful being. Saying all powerfulness is somehow a property of the soul thingy is arbitrary. You could just put in pineappleness or spaghettiness and say, oh, it's a property of the soul thingy, and therefore it's simple to have a magical pineapple. It's an arbitrary definition of simple.
One thing I'll just add for that questioner, on my blog, I don't know if you know where my blog is, but I will post up Caleb Miller's new paper about this because he goes into great detail arguing for the simplicity of God and what that entails and stuff like that. So you can check that out.
All right. Well, the next question we have is for Tom. Wouldn't it's something maximally great also have cognitive power, since if it didn't, then it wouldn't be maximal and instead limited?
No. So complete honesty here, I have no intuition that maximal would entail intelligence. If there was such a thing as maximal in reality, there's no reason to think it would have intelligence whatsoever. I think it's more like a quantum field would be the maximally great thing that has no mind, no consciousness, just a fundamental law of nature. Seems to be the maximally great thing. Minds seem to be an emergent thing, no different than pineapples. So saying that there is a consciousness or a mind in the fundamental thing is no different than saying there's a pineapple in the fundamental thing.
All right. Well, I'm gonna Dale, do you want to comment on that one real quick?
So I should have read the question. I think so why is knowledge? So I tried to avoid this because I remember how my conversation with TJump went last time, and we spent like a lot of time on this notion of objective intrinsic properties. And most people think that positive properties like having omniscience or something like that, or knowledge is definitely, it's good in and of itself. It's intrinsically good to have knowledge. But yeah, that's how I would kind of respond. I try to avoid that entirely using Eugen's top-down approach in this debate, though.
All right. Well, we're going to move into closing statements. Just a couple minutes here for each, and plug your ministries or your shows and so forth. So I'll let Dale start so we can give Tom the last word.
Yeah, so this is my closing word. So yeah, I just want to say thank you to TJump for coming on and having this interesting debate. I hope I did better this time. I was told behind the scenes to be more gung-ho than I was last time. So I tried to be a little bit more assertive there and stuff. But yeah, it was a great conversation. I think there were some interesting substantive points brought up. Good fruitful areas for more explanation. As I said, I'm going to be posting up a bunch of peer-reviewed scholarly papers on a bunch of this stuff on the arguments that I was giving, and so you can explore that in case I didn't explain it properly in the show. My thing is Real Seeker Ministries, so the blog is at realseekerministries.wordpress.com, or else just go to my YouTube channel, Real Seekers, and I've got a bunch of stuff there.
All right, Tom.
Yeah, thanks guys for having me on. Thanks for Real Seeker for coming and doing the debate again. It was pleasant talking with you. I don't think you need to be more aggressive. I think your demeanor is perfectly fine.
Awesome.
Please come to my Discord to discuss with everybody else sometime, like whenever you want. TJump.io or discord.io/TJump. Happy to have all of the guys here there. That would be awesome. Yeah, just in conclusion, I think that the ontological argument is just making stuff up, playing with definitions, and it can never tell us anything about reality. It's just definitional. That's why it's not really taken seriously in philosophy for the most part. But yeah, thanks again for having me on. Really appreciate it. Happy to come back anytime. Please join my Discord server, everybody on both audiences. And thanks.
All right. Well, again, I thank both of you guys for coming on. This has been real fun. Again, y'all are welcome to come back sometime in February. We'll probably host a guest host month. So if you want to moderate a debate or get one out there yourself, you can do that on this show as well. And both of y'all invited to do that. Yeah. Anyways, Caleb, you got anything else for us before we head out?
No, not at the moment. I thought each of them did a good job, and I hope I didn't butt in too many times to ask for clarification.
Yeah. So Caleb, do you have anything on Bishop Angelakis?
Oh, our exorcist.
Yeah.
I'll contact him tomorrow. Actually, I think we're supposed to have him sometime. I think what is it, the 16th or like
the 30th? One of those.
Oh, the
one
30th.
Of those dates.
Okay.
16th,
Yeah. That'd be, yeah. I'll reach back out to him. So I'm excited for that show.
Yep. So we got a lot of great content coming for you guys in the future here. So stay tuned, and we will see you next time.
Thanks.
All right, guys, we're done.
All right, cool.
All right, man.
We'll